My name is Donna Whitmore, and I was 34 years old when my husband looked at me across our dining table and told me that opening our marriage would save it. I didn't laugh, I didn't argue, I didn't even raise my voice. I just felt something cold and unmistakable settle in my chest, the way you feel when you realize the ground beneath you has already given way, even though you're still standing. Before that moment, I would have told anyone who asked that my life was stable. Ordinary, maybe even boring by modern standards, but solid. I worked a steady job, lived below my means, and believed that love was something you built quietly over time. My husband and I didn't scream at each other. We didn't throw things or storm out dramatically. We had shared calendars, joint accounts, and a Sunday morning routine that involved burnt pancakes, black coffee, and him scrolling headlines aloud while I pretended to care more than I did. His name was Martin Whitmore. We'd been together 8 years, married for 5. When we met, he was finishing his graduate program, uncertain and ambitious in equal measure. I supported him through it all, emotionally, financially, practically. I was the one who remembered deadlines, paid bills on time, kept our lives running smoothly when he got lost in big ideas and bigger feelings. Martin used to say he loved that about me. "You're grounded," he'd tell me. "You make everything feel manageable." And for a long time, I believed that being someone's safe place was enough. The changes didn't come all at once. They never do. First, he stopped asking me to pick him up after late evenings on campus. Then weekends became hazy drinks with coworkers, long dinners. I wasn't invited to vague explanations delivered with an absent smile. I didn't push. I trusted him. I trusted us. Then the language changed. One night, while we folded laundry, he asked casually, like he was commenting on the weather, "Have you ever thought about how unhealthy monogamy can be?" I laughed at first. I honestly thought it was a joke. He didn't laugh back. Over the following weeks, new phrases crept into our conversations: non-traditional fluid connection, evolving intimacy. He sent me podcasts and articles, told me they'd really opened his mind. I tried listening to one on my commute home and turned it off halfway through, unsettled by how easily commitment was being reframed as limitation. The first time I felt truly uneasy was the night he came home slightly buzzed from a birthday party I hadn't been invited to. I was already in bed when he sat beside me and said almost thoughtfully, "Did you know couples in open marriages report higher satisfaction, more trust even?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. He smiled like he was warming me up to an idea I simply hadn't caught up to yet. I felt cold anyway. Looking back, that was the moment something shifted. He wasn't talking with me anymore. He was testing me, measuring how far he could push without consequence. A week later, I came home to candlelight wine and takeout from the overpriced Thai place he only ordered from when something mattered. He was dressed carefully, not seductive, just intentional. I didn't sit. I asked him what was going on. "Can we eat first?" he said gently. We ate. He talked about his day. I nodded and barely heard a word. My body was there, but my mind was already bracing for impact. Finally, after refilling his glass, he sighed like he'd just completed a difficult task. "I want us to consider an open marriage," he said slowly, carefully. I stayed silent. He mistook that for permission. "I've been reading studies," he continued. "Couples who choose each other every day instead of staying out of obligation. Don't you want that? An open marriage will save us. You're just too insecure to see it." That was the moment everything broke. I asked him quietly if he'd already found someone else. He denied it too quickly, too defensively. When I stood and told him I wouldn't do this, he accused me of being rigid, backward, afraid of growth. I told him I wasn't afraid of change. I was afraid of being disrespected and called evolved for tolerating it. That night I slept in the guest room, not because we were fighting, but because the marriage was already over. And deep down, we both knew it. I didn't argue with him after that. I didn't check his phone or demand reassurance. I went quiet. And that silence, I would later learn, scared him far more than anger ever could. Silence changes the temperature of a room. I learned that in the days after that dinner, when Martin continued moving through our apartment as if nothing fundamental had cracked beneath us while I existed beside him like a closed door he kept pretending wasn't there. I didn't punish him with cruelty or sarcasm. I didn't slam cabinets or throw accusations into the air just to hear something break. I simply stopped offering him access to my inner world, and that withdrawal unsettled him in ways he didn't yet understand. The morning after I slept in the guest room, he brewed coffee like he always did, humming faintly, scrolling through his phone while the machine gurgled to life. When he handed me a mug, he He talked about a podcast episode he'd listened to on his way to work, something about emotional liberation and unlearning outdated relationship models. I nodded, thanked him for the coffee, and left early. I could feel his eyes on my back waiting for a reaction that never came. That became the pattern. He talked. I listened without engaging. He justified. I acknowledged without agreeing. He smiled too brightly, like someone trying to convince himself the room wasn't filling with smoke. I didn't need to raise my voice to make my position clear. My calm did the work for me. Inside, though, I was anything but calm. There were moments at work when grief would surface unexpectedly sharp and disorienting, like I'd lost someone without being allowed to mourn them. 8 years doesn't disappear overnight. You don't simply detach from a life you built brick by brick because someone reframed betrayal as philosophy. But clarity had arrived alongside the pain, and that clarity told me one thing over and over again: I was done negotiating my dignity. Martin mistook my restraint for indecision. One evening, as he stood in the doorway watching me read, he said, "You know you don't have to shut down like this. We could actually talk this through if you'd stop pulling away." I looked up at him then, finally meeting his eyes, and told him calmly that I had listened very carefully to what he wanted. I just wasn't willing to sacrifice myself to make him feel progressive. He scoffed, masking his discomfort with annoyance. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be," he said. "Nothing has even happened." Something had already happened. He just refused to name it. That week, while Martin experimented with acting unbothered, I met with a lawyer during my lunch break. I didn't announce it. I didn't threaten. I asked questions. We had no children, no shared property beyond the apartment lease and joint accounts. The logistics were painfully simple. The emotional weight, however, pressed down on me as I walked back to my car, the folder tucked beneath my arm like a quiet truth no one else could see yet. At home, Martin grew restless. He started dressing better before going out, staying later, coming home smelling like unfamiliar cologne layered over his usual soap. He talked about new friends, new perspectives, new possibilities, always careful to frame them as abstract intellectual pursuits rather than personal indulgences. He wanted me to react to protest, to cry. He wanted proof that I was still emotionally invested enough to fight. Instead, I began detaching piece by piece. I stopped cooking his favorite meals. I stopped reminding him about appointments. I stopped filling in the gaps when he forgot to show up emotionally. I wasn't being petty. I was being honest. I had spent years being the stabilizing force in his life, and the moment he decided stability was stagnation, I let him experience what living without it felt like. By Friday, I knew pretending was over. I came home from work with the legal documents tucked neatly into my bag. Martin was in the bathroom applying cologne, glancing at his phone between sprays. When I asked him to sit down, he groaned like I was interrupting something trivial. "Can this wait?" he said. "I have plans." "No," I replied, my voice even. "It can't." He sat on the couch, reluctantly, arms crossed, irritation etched across his face. When I placed the papers on the coffee table between us, he stared at them without comprehension. At first, like they were written in another language. Then realization hit and he laughed. Actually laughed, shaking his head as if I'd just told a joke he didn't appreciate. "You're serious?" he asked. "You're really doing this?" I looked at him and felt nothing but certainty. The silence I'd cultivated had done its work. There was no drama left in me to offer him, no emotional chaos to distract from the truth. "Yes," I said simply. And in that moment, the power shifted. Martin's laughter faded, quickly replaced by disbelief that curdled into irritation. He picked up the papers, flipped through them with exaggerated carelessness, then tossed them back onto the table like they were an insult. "You're really going to end our marriage over a conversation?" he asked, his voice sharp with forced calm. Because I suggested something progressive, I didn't rush to answer. I watched him pace the living room, running a hand through his hair, already rehearsing the narrative where he was the visionary and I was the obstacle. I told him quietly that the marriage had ended the moment he decided my discomfort was a flaw to be corrected instead of a boundary to be respected, that he hadn't suggested growth, he'd demanded compliance. That's when the contempt surfaced. He accused me of being rigid, boring, emotionally unavailable. He said I was afraid of anything I couldn't control, that my version of love was small and cautious and built on fear. He framed my refusal as proof that he'd been right all along to want more, something freer, something less confined. Listening to him, I realized he wasn't angry because I was leaving. He was angry because I'd taken the moral high ground without asking permission. When he finally stopped pacing, he crossed his arms and said with a thin smile, "Fine. File your papers. I'll sign whatever you want. But don't come crawling back when you realize no one else will put up with you." I nodded, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. That was the last card he had left to play. That night, I packed a small bag. I left behind the furniture we'd picked out together, the wedding photos, the dishes still drying in the rack. I didn't take anything that required an argument. When I walked out, he was standing in the doorway, watching me with an expression that flickered between triumph and uncertainty, like he was waiting for me to break and beg him to stop me. I didn't. The apartment door closed softly behind me, and with it a version of my life I'd spent nearly a decade protecting. The quiet that followed felt different from silence. It felt earned. I moved into a small one-bedroom across town. It wasn't impressive, but it was clean, uncomplicated, and entirely mine. The first night there, I lay awake, listening to the hum of the city outside, processing the strange mix of grief and relief that settled in my chest. I didn't miss Martin the way I thought I would. That loss had started long before I packed my bag. What I felt instead was the absence of tension, the absence of waiting for the next conversation that would make me feel smaller. I didn't block him immediately. I muted his messages and let them sit unread, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. For a few days there was nothing. I imagined he expected me to panic, to reach out to say I'd reconsider. When that didn't happen, the first message arrived. So I guess this is really happening. I didn't respond. A few days later, another. "You seriously just walked away after everything." That was when the tone shifted. Mutual acquaintances started reaching out, people who liked to call themselves neutral. They told me Martin was confused, hurt, blindsided, that he thought I'd come around eventually. I told them all the same thing, that the line had been crossed, and I didn't look back once I was out. Then the updates began arriving without my asking. The man Martin had been just talking to lost interest once the rebellion lost its edge. Dating apps followed, then exhaustion. Someone mentioned he looked desperate, hollowed out. The apartment we once shared was too expensive for one person, and soon after he moved back in with his parents, who apparently didn't understand his journey either. Meanwhile, my life grew quieter in the best possible way. I went to the gym again. I cooked real meals. I read books without feeling guilty for enjoying stillness. There was no dramatic transformation, no revenge arc. I didn't need one. I was becoming myself again, steady and present, without anyone trying to convince me that peace was a problem. 3 weeks after I filed the paperwork, his voicemail came. His voice sounded smaller, uncertain. He said he'd been thinking about us, about everything. He said he missed the safety, the quiet, the way I made life feel manageable. He asked me to call him back. I saved the message not because I wanted to hear it again, but because it marked the moment his fantasy finally cracked. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't realized I'd been craving for years. My mornings were slow and deliberate. I woke up early, brewed coffee, stretched by the window, and let silence exist without trying to fill it. There was no background noise from someone else's phone, no half-listened conversations drifting through the apartment, no tension humming beneath ordinary routines. Just space. And in that space, I began to understand how much of myself I'd been holding back to keep a marriage functioning. I didn't think about Martin constantly, but he wasn't gone from my life entirely either. News of him reached me in fragments passed along by people who didn't know they were carrying cautionary tales. He tried to lean into his newfound freedom, posting cryptic quotes online about self-discovery and unlearning limitations. He went out often at first, chasing novelty with the intensity of someone trying to outrun regret. But novelty doesn't last when it's no longer forbidden, and neither did the attention he'd been so sure was waiting for him. The dating apps came next. According to a coworker who ran into him one evening, he looked tired, distracted, like someone playing a role that no longer fit. The charm he'd relied on didn't land the way it used to. There was no wife at home to rebel against anymore, no stability to push off from while declaring himself evolved. Without contrast, his narrative fell flat. Eventually, reality crept in. The apartment he'd insisted on keeping was too expensive. The joint account strained faster without my careful budgeting. Not long after, he moved back in with his parents. I heard his mother confiscated one of the books he'd been quoting so confidently months earlier and told him to stop acting like he was hosting a podcast and start acting like an adult. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't once been my life. While his world contracted, mine expanded quietly. I got promoted at work. I started cooking again, not out of obligation, but because I enjoyed it. I slept better than I had in years. There was no dramatic glow-up, no grand announcement that I was thriving. I just felt lighter, unburdened by the constant need to justify my boundaries or explain why respect mattered to me. Then one evening, I came home from the gym and found Martin sitting on the steps outside my building. He looked smaller somehow, stripped of the confidence that used to fill every room he walked into. He stood when he saw me, hands shoved into the pockets of a worn hoodie, eyes searching my face like he expected to find something familiar there. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice tentative. I didn't answer right away. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, forcing him to follow if he wanted to continue. He accused me of being cold, of ignoring him, of walking away from 5 years, like it meant nothing. I told him calmly that I'd walked away the moment he decided he needed other people to feel whole, and that his regret didn't obligate me to return. He said he never cheated, that nothing had happened yet. I reminded him that wanting permission to betray someone and mocking them for refusing was still betrayal. He shifted then, anger flickering across his face, calling me heartless, accusing me of abandoning him when he was trying to grow. I told him growth that required my humiliation was never growth at all. For a moment he looked stunned. Then the rage drained out of him, leaving only something fragile and unrecognizable. "So that's it," he said quietly. "You're just done." "I've been done," I replied. He stood there searching for something cruel enough to say to reopen the wound, but there was nothing left to break. I closed the door behind me and locked it, feeling no triumph, no satisfaction, only finality. I thought that night would be the end of it. For a brief moment, it felt complete, like the last page of a chapter I'd already grieved. But people who build their identities on being right rarely let go quietly, and Martin was no exception. Over the next few days, his messages arrived in clusters, each one contradicting the last. One minute he was indignant, accusing me of being cruel and inflexible. The next, he was pleading, telling me he knew I still loved him and that I was just scared to admit it. I didn't respond to any of them, not because I wanted to punish him, but because there was nothing left to explain. Every explanation I could have given had already been offered when it mattered, back when my boundaries were still being negotiated instead of ignored. Now all he wanted was reassurance that the door he'd slammed could somehow be reopened if he knocked hard enough. The messages eventually softened. He said he missed the quiet, the safety, the way I made life feel grounded. He said he'd been wrong, that he thought opening the marriage would make us stronger, not realizing it would cost him everything. There was a desperation in his words that would have broken my heart once. Now it only confirmed what I already knew: he didn't miss me. He missed what I provided. The final message was the simplest. "You win. I'll do anything. Just come home." That was when I knew with absolute clarity that I wouldn't. I didn't feel victorious. There was no rush of satisfaction, no sense of triumph. I felt calm. I felt done. Winning had never been the point. Choosing myself had been. The last update I heard came from a mutual acquaintance a few weeks later. Martin was working part-time at a boutique while trying to figure out his next move. He slept on a mattress in his parents' guest room, his books stacked in the corner like artifacts from a life he no longer recognized. His father apparently told him to stop chasing theories and start taking responsibility. His mother kept asking when he planned to move out. Meanwhile, my life continued its quiet, steady progression. I woke up early. I brewed coffee. I read. I worked. I slept well. There was no drama waiting for me at the end of the day, no emotional minefields to navigate. Just peace. I didn't need to prove anything to him. I didn't need closure delivered through apologies or self-awareness that came too late. Closure had arrived the moment I stopped participating in a game I never agreed to play. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly in small moments that added up before I realized what they were doing. Mornings where I woke without dread. Evenings where silence felt like a gift instead of a punishment. I stopped bracing myself for conflict that never came. There was no one left to convince, no version of myself I needed to defend. Looking back, I understand now that the marriage didn't end because Martin wanted an open relationship. It ended because he stopped seeing me as a partner and started seeing me as an obstacle to his self-image. He needed me to be small so he could feel expansive. When I refused, the illusion collapsed. I thought about the dinner with the candles, sometimes the way he'd smiled at me, like he was offering enlightenment instead of erasure. I remembered how certain he'd been, that I'd cave, that I'd be too afraid of loss to walk away. In his mind, stability was something to rebel against, not something to protect. He never understood that stability isn't boring when it's mutual. It's only suffocating when one person decides they deserve more at the other's expense. I never reached out again, not out of spite, but out of respect for myself and for the truth of what had happened. Some doors don't need to be slammed to be closed. Some endings don't require fireworks or final speeches. They end because continuing would mean betraying yourself. Martin faded into the background of my life, a cautionary memory rather than an open wound. I didn't wish him harm, but I also didn't wish him back. His regret was real, I think, but it came too late to matter. By the time he realized what he'd lost, I had already built a life that didn't include him. Now my days are simple. I work, I read, I cook, I rest. I move through the world without the constant weight of someone else's dissatisfaction pressing against my chest. I don't wonder who's texting across the table or what philosophy will be used next to justify hurting me. I don't need to win arguments or prove I was right. All I needed was to stop playing. An open marriage can't save you when one person has already decided they deserve everything while asking the other to accept less. And love doesn't evolve by erasing the person who gave you safety in the first place.